Well, since we last talked, quite a bit of water's gone under the bridge since you were last here. And that was like, what, 4 years ago? Something like that? Gosh, it seems longer than that. It must have been 5 or 6 years ago. So I'm not gonna tell you everything that's gone on since then. What I can tell you is that I've been busy this last year, as you all already know, working on this book, which I have just finished, and it's just launching. It's called The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, My Life with Terence McKenna, so we can get the plug out of the way. But I raised money starting in spring of 2011. I decided I needed to write this book, and I needed to do it pretty much before 2012, the end of 2012, and also while I can still remember things. So I had this compulsion to sort of write this book, and the question was, how do I make the time? As I told you earlier, time is the most valuable thing I had. So the question is, how do you make enough time and resources to undertake a project like this without finding a publisher, which I didn't want to do for various reasons. So actually Terence's old friend and former editor, Dan Levy, brought my attention to Kickstarter at the time when I shared the idea with him, and he said, why don't you try Kickstarter? Give it a, who knows, maybe it won't work. Well, so I did, and it turns out it worked very well. I raised actually more money on Kickstarter at the time than anyone ever raised to write a book. Wow. And that's only because of the Terence McKenna fan club, if you will. People know his name, and there's a big group of people that identify with him. So, and are interested in his story, but our story, really. And I needed to write this book for multiple reasons, really. But I felt that, because we're coming close to this end date that there is so much attention on, I don't think necessarily, that 12/21/12 is going to be some enormous cataclysmic event. But certainly in people's minds, it's a significant date. And I felt that, I never really had a chance to tell my side of the story out of my own mouth, from my own perspective, before now. And Terence has narrated, our story and the whole thing for many decades, and most people are familiar with that. So I thought, well, I should say what happened, what my perspective on all that is, and my experiences growing up, and what influenced us. Terence was my older brother, and quite a, and that alone is a big influence. But then when you're Terence and into all the stuff he was into, you can imagine that the poor little brother was really quite impacted, and in a good way, mostly. I mean, I have to credit Terence for getting me into all these bizarre places, all these peculiar and eclectic interests. He led the charge, and I wanted to be involved. And then later, our relationship became much more sort of equal in a sense, or complementary, I would say, because Terence is kind of the philosopher of hyperspace, and I stay more on the science side, stay more in the background too, more or less by choice. But I just felt like it was time to tell the story, and I feel very good that I've had that chance. people are beginning to see it now, and I'm getting pretty good feedback. People are liking it. Only a few have really seen it, but I guess now that it's actually available as an ebook and so on.
Seems appropriate that we bring up the conversation of the legalization of recreational use of cannabis in Colorado and Washington State, which recently passed this November. So.
Yeah, and it's very encouraging. It's very encouraging that the state, the people pass these referendums. The people are always out in front of the government, right, by several years, in terms of what makes good policy, and the people have realized for a long time that, the illegal status of cannabis is just a joke. We have to find reasonable ways to regulate it, tax it if necessary, but it should not be prohibited. It's far less harmful short-term or long-term than alcohol, which is, I think, one reason why it's been suppressed for so long, because the alcohol lobby is so strong. It's not in their interests to see another much safer and, incidentally, much more interesting and even helpful recreational drug approved.
Considering it's a medicine, and also then you have the pharmaceutical industry that's really lobbying against that, trying to prevent a plant that anybody can have access
They're
to.
lobbying against it, even as back in the laboratory, their medicinal chemists are furiously turning out, cannabinoid receptor agonists and antagonists. I mean, you look at their research initiatives and wonder, and ask the question, well, does cannabis have medicinal value? Well, ask the pharmaceutical guys. They're furiously trying to develop new patented drugs that will target these same receptors, and those will be absolutely impeccably therapeutic, right, with no possible, side effects. Well, the lowly plant will, continue to be reviled. So it's the same old story, To my mind, the rubber meets the road in terms of what will the federal government's reaction to the passage of these initiatives be. I think Obama's in a great position to leave a legacy in this area too, as he's going to leave, I think, a legacy in a number of areas. Now that the election is over, he will have a chance to be remembered as the president, not so much who reformed drug policy, I think that's going to take a long time, but as the president under whose term it began to turn around. And the conversation became more rational and kind of more about, okay, how do we do this? Cannabis is here to stay. There's going to be only more and more psychoactive drugs, not less. It's just what happens as we move into the future. How do we approach this? And the idea that you can ban every substance that you might find in nature or conceive, in the mind of clever chemists is just absurd. You cannot control drugs that way. The idea of new substance, like whack-a-mole, a new drug comes up, okay, ban that one, well, next week there's an analog, you ban that one. No, I've always said you have to approach this in terms of educating people. It's all about human behavior. Drug abuse is not something it's not a property of the drugs. The drugs are not demons. The drugs are not pathogens. The drugs are simply chemical substances that have this and that chemical property and this and that pharmacological property. The whole crux of the drug abuse conundrum is you have to teach people how to employ these substances in ways that are appropriate, that are not harmful, and that maximize benefits even. You even have to bring that into the conversation. as we know, since we're part of this community, we attribute benefits to cannabis, we attribute benefits to psychedelics. That's why we use them, because we see we get something out of them. But in the drug policy and that sort of drug, regulatory sort of framework, for you to suggest that, well, maybe smoking cannabis has benefits is a heretical thing to say. So you have to bring that into the conversation. You just have to start talking across the table to each other. The whole problem with drug policy discussions and whether these things should be legalized for decades has been the two factions can't talk to each other. There is no way that you can have a rational conversation, because everyone's got their position stated and staked out, and the response is, my mind is made up, don't bother me with facts. And so you can't have a conversation on that basis.